You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 305. I'm your host, Heather McDaniel-McDevitt, and joining me today is Bill in Northern California.
Good morning.
Andrew in Southern California, not so sunny Southern California today.
It's kind of rainy, which is awesome. And hello, everyone. It is nice to be here.
And Doug in Scotland. Is it rainy or sunny in Scotland right now, Doug?
Well, it's 5:15 and it's winter, so there is no sun. The sun set like half an hour ago, maybe. I mean, like it's getting nicer. The days are getting longer, but yeah, like. But even if there was sun, it's a bit rainy out. So, yeah. But yeah. Different question, different time of the years. It's gonna be fun.
Well, I think we're both in the rainy period. It was more in March, actually, when I was in Ireland a few years ago, and it was pretty rainy.
There's no rainy period. It's always rainy.
It's just rain.
Yeah. Like there's
like Washington and Portland,
like you're looking at rain on like an individual day basis, not like a season, because it's just always fairly crap in terms of weather. So like, there's no such thing. Like, don't ever like if anyone tells you, oh yeah, you should come during these months. It's the nicer months. Yeah, that's a lie. That's a lie.
Well, that's why they have that saying of there is no bad weather. There's only bad clothing, because there's only bad weather.
Exactly.
Well, you responded.
100%.
Yeah. Well, today we had a question come in to the APN website, and here's the question. I'm wondering maybe if you could share on the CRM podcast about the role of CRM in rebuilding Los Angeles. So I thought, there are several different aspects of this. I think maybe we could take it in a chronological order. First thing is involvement in the cleanup, involvement in the first stages, right? Because none of this is going to get built up for quite a while. And I think, if anybody's listening to the news, you understand that it's not just about rebuilding these homes, right? And I'm sure most of the homeowners, that's what they're focused on. That's what they should be focused on. They're homeless right now. So, but it's also about the infrastructure. The level of heat that occurred was just so unbelievable. And in most fires, I think a lot of people sometimes forget that it's the infrastructure underneath, the wires, all the utilities, everything that can be destroyed as well, due to the high amount of heat. And then, the other thing is that a lot of, the reasons for these fires certainly have something to do with the way our infrastructure is designed and the talk of having our infrastructure subsurface, right? So this is an opportunity, sadly, that these, both of these, the Pacific Palisades and the Altadena area, that these two areas were just devastated community-wide, that it is an opportunity to rebuild the infrastructure properly and to look forward to maybe mitigating some of the risks that lead to some of these fires. And it's not always, everybody likes to blame, PG&E and these electrical companies. That is part of the problem. There's quite a few other issues that led to the level of devastation that occurred a few weeks ago. So I first just want to kind of open up and, see what you guys think in general.
Sure. First I'll just tell my short backstory though. Like as being somebody who kind of was tangentially affected by the fires. So I live on the sort of outskirts of the LA area, but our power was out for 4 days in total. It was out for 3 days and then another singular day. I was actually also evacuated from Moorpark, from the school where I work, because a very small fire that you guys didn't hear about, right, started very close, but they were able to contain it. So the last 2 weeks have been very difficult for, obviously, of course, I'm not comparing my situation to people who lost their homes and this kind of stuff, but the entire Southern California basin, basically, I think many of us still have our important papers and stuff in our car, at this point, because there were so many moments where it's like, oh my God, okay, we got to get ready again. Oh my God. And it's been very taxing. So yeah, it was a very incredible time to just sort of live through and watch. And also, I'll say I used to live in Pasadena, so I know, some of those areas, and I'm so sad for them. And also, to bring this full circle to CRM, I used to work for a CRM firm that was located in Pacific Palisades. So and the firm was run out of the person's home in Pacific Palisades. So I worked in Pacific Palisades for a lot. And I know for like a fact that place is just, it's all gone. And so it's very shocking when you've had, personal experiences in these places and that they're just not there anymore. And I will say, Heather, I think this is a great topic for today because everyone in Los Angeles is basically super curious about the nuts and bolts of, okay, how do these people actually rebuild? What are the hurdles? And I think we should spend the whole time basically just talking about that stuff because everyone wants to know.
Yeah. And I want to second that too, because the, folks that were displaced and everything, the San Francisco area is very far from the fires. And this year was pretty wet up here. So we won't have to worry really about those kind of crazy firestorms like they had in Southern California, in Northern California for months now. Right. But the reality is in Northern California, those firestorms that tore up Paradise and other towns. I mean, there were students and stuff that go to the place where I work and they, have been badly affected. And it's been years and those places never necessarily came back, right? There's a whole combination of things that happen after your entire town burns down. Yeah. So folks that are listening, first of all, like you mentioned, Andrew, the people who were directly affected, the folks in the LA area, I mean, this is one of those kind of defining moments that have caused trauma across a huge spectrum. And so, we should never forget about that. It's not just homes that were lost. It's entire lives, right? Generational, landscapes gone all the way. And, folks displaced all over the area. And then everyone else that's in the LA basin got to think about, well, is this going to happen to them, right? Because the environmental conditions are across the entire southern half of the state. And there's tens of millions of people that live in this area. So it's not just, a one-off thing. And so folks could be listening from anywhere else in the country, as we saw from these hurricanes that destroyed North Carolina that still has flood water and Asheville still torn up. People who live in places like Florida who have seen this kind of stuff, the folks who are going to live in the areas that are going to see these huge heat waves this summer that, the 2024 was the hottest ever. I think people should start opening their heart and their mind to, we got to really just change the entire way that we live and the way we think about the world, because this stuff is coming for everyone in the country. And the best thing that happens from it is how people come together and help each other out. All the folks who have shown up to provide food and clothing in the near term, and how we're talking about rebuilding, they will come together. They will figure something out. But, in the wake of these storms, people and their neighbors come together. And that's the true thing that's going to get all of us through all of this, right? Because we can't stop the way the world is changing, but we can definitely help all the other folks that are directly affected.
Agreed. Doug?
Yeah, well, I'll look a little positive to Bill's comment. And you shouldn't look at it as this is the hottest year on record. It's the coolest year of the rest of your life is how you should be looking at it. But yeah, to Bill's point, it's going to get worse for decades forward, if not centuries. And to sort of switch it around back to sort of the impact. So Los Angeles is going to be at a different scale, but this sort of thing has happened in the past, various different parts in the country. So about 25 years ago, they burned down Los Alamos. A controlled fire went out of control. They lit a controlled burn when like the winds were like 60 and 80 miles per hour, and they ended up burning down half of the town of Los Alamos in New Mexico. So, most people know it from the labs and home of the atomic bomb, but it does take a very long process to rebuild, and it'll be years, if not, I mean, there was still stuff like a decade later that hadn't quite been rebuilt in the town. And that's sort of normal for the sort of processes that's going to happen and go through for, rebuilding. And CRM will probably play a part in that because you guys have a statewide CRM law, don't you?
Yes.
In California?
Yeah.
Well,
Yes,
I mean, it's an environmental law, but it includes cultural resources statewide.
Correct.
Yeah, and I imagine that is it a greater coverage? Because, there's obviously the federal laws, but that's usually federal land / federal money provided. And it depends how extreme they're going to do the rebuild. So if, some of that infrastructure involves federal money, that might involve it. But I imagine you guys, I think you were talking earlier that there's more specific legislation that would probably impact most of the houses being rebuilt in those areas. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Or am I off?
I wanted to talk about that. I think a lot of people, at least I'm seeing on the social media sites, a lot of kind of concern for, actually more for people's jobs than they are concerned about the people. I mean, maybe that's unfair, but, concerned that that CRM is going to be pretty much eliminated from the equation of these rebuilds. And that's not true. That's not going to happen. You have different levels of funding, different levels of jurisdiction. Obviously, you have the local, you have the state, and you have the federal. And just like Doug said, and I think we'll finish up this segment just with laying the groundwork for the conversation for the next two segments. So federal funds, just like Doug said, you're going to have federal involvement, Section 106. When you have federal funding, if it's on federal land or some kind of federal permitting. And actually, the federal permitting is usually what comes in, that's more common than the other two. But in this case, because you have federal funding through FEMA, there is some kind of, Section 106 is required. Now, it sounds like there may be some workarounds that will be happening, not that it will be done, to completely ignore cultural resources. But I worked on the FEMA effort for the Montecito mudslides and the Thomas fire that happened 5-6 years ago. And, it just happens very quickly. Those FEMA responses obviously have to happen very quickly. And so it can't be a long drawn out process. The federal, we have yet to see where that's going to go and what limitations are going to be put on the Section 106 consultation process, how it might be streamlined a bit. The next is the state, and that's in California, CEQA, what we call CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. California Environmental Quality Act actually was written very much at the same time as NEPA. And it's very similar because a lot of the same people are involved in the writing of both. And so it's very, very similar. In fact, it might be how it is facilitated. And how it is facilitated is actually a little stronger sometimes than NEPA, but CEQA is in play here for sure. And then you have the local regulations. And those local regulations cannot diminish or lessen CEQA, but they can increase it. So I think with that said, we'll move on to the next segment and we'll really talk about, I think the one thing that we need to do, and I'll leave this segment with this, is that the way that we can, as CRM professionals, understand our role in rebuilding during, after these types of disasters, and in general, I think, is to stay away from the emotional arguments and to really look at what are the legal ramifications, what are the legal parameters of this kind of work. Because really, really what is going to, in the end, win the day as far as what occurs and what doesn't relevant to CRM. So we'll be right back. Welcome back to CRM Archaeology podcast number 305, segment 2. We are talking about CRM role in the rebuilding of the LA area after the fires. And we finished off with just a brief explanation on the jurisdiction of federal, state, and local agencies in the process. We didn't really delve in, but just kind of defined the three. Doug, you had your hand up before we ended the segment.
Yeah, it was a question about the local stuff. Do you guys know if there's specific local ordinances that are in place in those areas, or I imagine part of those areas, the fires have probably crossed several municipal boundaries, maybe not. I'm not a California person, so you guys are all throwing around like, oh yeah, and Encino and yada yada. I'm like, oh yeah, I mean that sounds like a place in California, but so does everything. So
don't worry, Doug, I never know where the hell they're talking about either. I have to Google it. I don't know any of the towns.
So I'll let you know. So Pacific Palisades, and maybe Andrew, you can jump in on the Altadena area, but Pacific Palisades is the one that everybody is seeing that's along the beach, and the devastation that happened. I mean, the little downtown. So Pacific Palisades is a section within the city of Los Angeles, just so that people know, and it's like it would be more considered a neighborhood, but it has its own little downtown area that had developed over years. It just was so cute. I do a lot of work in Pacific Palisades. It's a beautiful area. Unlike what a lot of I think the perception that people have, yes, there are wealthy people that live there. There are celebrities that live there, but they're few compared to the everyday resident. And these residents, like many people in California, have lived here. It's generational. And these properties, there's no way that if these individuals that lived on these properties were to come to Pacific Palisades today, they wouldn't be able to afford to live there. But because they have inherited the land and the homes over generations, and because of that, you have such a vibrant, amazing community here in Pacific Palisades. And you'll probably be finding out, those that are not from here will be finding out more and more about Pacific Palisades, just like we did about the Paradise Fire, the community that lived there. So, it's important to understand that these are people with average incomes that are now having to rebuild their homes. They do not have fire insurance many of them, because their fire insurance had lapsed. And they were trying to figure out how to get fire insurance. So if you don't live in California, you may not know this, but in areas where there's a high propensity for fire, and there's other things, other issues, other components of these decisions, insurance companies have pulled out of certain areas because the risk is just too great. And insurance, they are a company. They do need to make money. They have shareholders that they have to answer to. And if the risk is too high, they pull out. And we could probably spend a whole amount of time on that, but there was a long time the fire insurance and companies didn't just pull out, in one day. There was a long lead time, like the law requires. And there were also fire insurance companies were trying to work with the state to figure out ways that they didn't have to pull out. And because of a lot of the environmental regulation, there were just the risks were too high, as you could see why, right? The results of that. So these people did not have fire insurance, and now they're in this predicament. This wasn't because they were lax in taking care of their responsibilities, because they were trying to figure out how are they going to get insurance. Because when you do have to have government backed insurance, it's extremely expensive. And that's just, it's awful. I used to live in Simi Valley. There's areas where fire insurance is just through the roof. And a lot of people just go self-insured or hope to throw their, themselves on the mercy of governmental assistance. So that is as far as Pacific Palisades. Andrew, do you want to explain just the context of where Altadena is?
Sure. Here, I'll do sort of a quick tour of all of it. And also, just to add for Pacific Palisades, for those of you who might know Southern California a little bit, it's just north of like Santa Monica. It's kind of like the next little tiny community in its own little valley, mini valley kind of thing, which is why it was so susceptible to the whole thing. And also Pacific Palisades, it was a community of all like mid-century modern homes. You know, it was awesome. They're all small. This was not a community of like multimillionaire McMansions. Not at all. These are like small, 1,400 square foot, kind of homes, all built in 1960, that kind of thing. It was very picturesque and awesome.
Interspersed with large mansions, but
there's a few, but overall, if you were driving along, you're like, oh, there's a lot of like 50s homes here, know?
Right.
And Heather's completely right about the sort of generational thing, and also the fire insurance thing, which I've had, bummer experiences with. I have it, but people who don't live around here realize that people are dying to try and get fire insurance around here. They really try and stay on top of it, but the insurance companies are so awful, in terms of just dealing with, and they're always just trying to screw you, and it's just a really, really difficult situation in terms of Altadena. So now we take a trip to the other side of Los Angeles. Pacific Palisades is on the western side. Altadena is on the eastern side. So you cross over the downtown where the big buildings are. And then in sort of the northeast corner, that's where Pasadena is, right? And then Altadena is kind of in the little like northeast corner of Pasadena. And of course, Altadena kind of buttresses up right against the San Gabriel Mountains, which is the other reason why Altadena, got hit, because it's right there kind of at the base of the mountain. So the fire sweeps down and hits it first. So Altadena got really hammered, and then even little parts of Pasadena right there. It's very hard to tell the boundary between Altadena and Pasadena. They just kind of flow together.
Well, so another thing to note too about Altadena compared to Pacific Palisades is Altadena was the neighborhood that Black people were allowed to live in that weren't allowed to live in actual Pasadena. So when we're talking about intergenerational wealth and passing things on, these are folks who have lived there for multiple generations through Jim Crow, who then their houses all torched. Right.
And but today, like if you go there, it's very multicultural, right? It's all, everyone's living everywhere. But historically, Bill is, absolutely correct. And even Altadena, and people hem and haw about the prices of homes in California. They're just all expensive. You know what I mean? Like even a little tiny home in Altadena is still going to be worth, $1 million, whereas Pacific Palisades will be like $2.5 million. It's all very expensive because that's just the world of California. And again, that doesn't mean the people living there are, multimillionaires, just like Bill and Heather were saying. It's generational. I mean, even for me, my mother owns her home in the Bay Area, but she couldn't buy her own house today. That's the story of so many Californians that I think often doesn't get told.
Yeah, I mean, I bought my house in 2017 and I couldn't afford to live on the street today.
Right. Me too.
So back to Doug's good point. Thanks, Andrew. Both. Back to Doug's question as far as the jurisdictional, the agencies that would be involved in the rebuilding of these areas. So in the Pacific Palisades, you have a entity called the California Coastal Commission that generally its purview is generally within a mile of the beach of the water.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just slightly taking it back. So, different parts of the states have different ways of doing your mega cities. We're like some basically, there's a city and then there's a bunch of suburbs and they all sort of get pulled in, but the suburbs actually will be either run by counties or by their own cities. Yeah. How is it in California? Has Los Angeles, like you guys have all these different names, so has Los Angeles like basically annexed all of these little towns? So it is actually Los Angeles, the city, or are these some of these like county, those weird county run cities, or are they their own city as well?
Totally. Yeah. So the answer is sometimes, Doug. Some of these cities we're talking about are their own city, and others are like a municipality of LA City. It just sort of it depends.
So you have So when it comes to, and Andrew's correct, and also when it comes to what agencies are in control, right, with building, you have areas where they're still considered Los Angeles, but it's not within the city limits. So then if there is no actual incorporation of a city within the county area, it falls onto the county of Los Angeles. So the lead agency would be the county of Los Angeles, even though I might be sitting and I'm saying I'm in Los Angeles, my address is Los Angeles. And you can have neighborhoods where people can choose to have a Los Angeles address. They can put at Los Angeles on the address, or they can put Pacific Palisades on the address. Yeah. It's still going to get to their home. And so if you have a neighborhood, generally you'll have the city of Los Angeles is so big that it has actual like specific plans for certain areas, what we call specific plans. And therefore they're to address a certain area because that area has different needs than another area in the city of Los Angeles. And so the regulations are going to be different, even though you have this overarching city of Los Angeles conditions, but then you can also have conditions that are very specific to that area. And then on top of that, you have the Coastal Commission. And the Coastal Commission is, like I said, their jurisdiction is generally within a mile from the ocean. And also it can change a little bit depending on the topography. So sometimes it's not always a mile and sometimes it might be a little bit more. But so in Pacific Palisades, the Coastal Commission has a lot of regulations. And I do a lot of work, like I said, in Pacific Palisades, and the Coastal Commission is the most involved. It is definitely the most difficult process to get through, although a lot of times you can have these agencies somewhat work together. So let's say you're doing an assessment, a cultural assessment for a single family home improvement or rebuilding. And the city of Los Angeles, the Coastal Commission, you'll do an assessment. The city of Los Angeles will work in concert, or the Coastal Commission will look at the assessment that was conducted for the city of Los Angeles, and they may impose their own conditions on top of the city of Los Angeles. Now, many times they're together, but they may be strengthened. So that's what's happened in that Pacific Palisades, is the Coastal Commission has, in order to streamline their efforts, and a lot of time people say streamlining, and that's going to help with, minimizing mitigation. In fact, sometimes it makes it worse because you have this streamlined approach, meaning you have a programmatic assessment of an area, and then you have conditions. You have these thresholds within this programmatic assessment that happened to address this entire area. And this is what the Coastal Commission has done in specific areas. And then they had these conditions that as long as your building meets or doesn't exceed the threshold of what they list off as fitting within this programmatic agreement, they have these conditions that you must abide by. And it's across the board. And sometimes it's monitoring, and these mitigation measures are not written very well. They're very burdensome on applicants. And these are not large developers. These are single family homes, and having to pay tens of thousands of dollars for ongoing monitoring throughout the entire construction process is onerous. It really does not make sense. And so these programmatic streamlining approaches a lot of times do not work. They don't work because they're not written properly. And then also people that work for the Coastal Commission are very conservative in their approach, and they don't want to make decisions. So they say, these are the conditions, that's what you have to follow. And it makes it very difficult. And that's part of what people are a bit up in arms about. Doug.
Is the Coastal Commission a state-based entity? I realize, in the wonderful world of government, you can have multiple different sort of things, but is it essentially the Coastal Commission all of the coast of California? So it's based at a state level, or is this like a Southern California thing?
It's state.
Okay. And do you guys have in California conservation zones or conservation areas at all?
Can you define that?
Yeah, okay. I'm realizing. Well, that's the question. So you run into it. Can be. You definitely get it in like Europe, where basically they'll map. They'll just draw a line around an area in a city, county, whatever landscape, and basically you then have additional regulations that go on with that for conservation for historical buildings and historical areas. You get it in like neighborhoods in certain different states and yeah, historic districts basically.
Oh yeah.
Right. Yes, we do have that.
Are any of these areas covered by that as well, or is that not these parts of? Sorry, I know nothing. I've been to LA like once, and it was just like a massive concrete jungle.
Yeah.
So I couldn't tell you.
Look a little closer next time, man. Yeah, like
more than that.
And you're right. Like there are some historic, overlay zones, and actually, I'm not sure if any of the historic overlay zones got hit. I'm not sure, but I do know, like in Altadena, that there are like historic homes and that kind of stuff that would be on the National Register and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because there's also the sort of, I guess, slightly complicating it. So are you talking National Register as in like U.S. National Register or
yes,
Register? Because doesn't California also have a state level register of
what I was talking about was the National Register, because that's we're talking national laws and stuff.
So that's a good question. So with respect to the federal funding, so when the federal funding comes into play, if it goes like any other federal funding, you're looking at only the national for the most part. There's other times you might be looking at other things, but for the most part, you're looking at National Register of Historic Resources. And the one thing to remember is it's not just, so let's say this wasn't due to a fire. Let's say you had federal funding and you have a historic building on your property. It doesn't end just at, is this on the list? It's just as important, is it eligible to be on the list? So there's a difference. You have properties that are eligible to be on the list, and then you have properties that are actually listed. And there's really no difference between the two, actually. What the difference is that you had a community effort, or for some reason, there was an effort to make sure that it was actually listed on the NRHP. But the non-listed but eligible to be on the list are just as important. They are treated in the same way, right? So you can have lots of resources that are eligible and are still subject to the same purview with federal monies and federal, actions than it would be if it was on the list. And it's the same thing for what's on the CRHR. Also, this pretty much, if you're on the CRHR, you're likely eligible also, in most cases, for the National Register as well. So they kind of, it's not like there's an abundance of more resources. You're usually eligible for both because the criteria is very similar, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
So why don't we'll take this to the next segment. The next segment, let's talk about what is our role as CRM professionals. What do we foresee, at least this group, foresee as what we're going to be doing in an effort to rebuild these areas? We'll be right back. Welcome back to CRM Archaeology Podcast number 305. We are talking about CRM's role in the rebuilding of these Los Angeles neighborhoods and areas that were devastated by the recent fires in early January of 2025.
I've vaguely seen like a 3D map of like the spread of the fire, so I have a rough idea of like the Paradise Palisades area.
Pacific Palisades.
Sorry, and apologies to anyone from California. I did not mean to mispronounce or get the wrong area. But from what it looked like it was a coastal road-ish and fairly, well, I guess it depends where you are in the world, but if you're based in the Midwest, it'd be some very extreme mountains.
Yeah.
Up to the side. other places maybe less so, but still quite hilly, and basically almost it looked like a small strip of sort of inhabitable areas along the coast. And then of course it's California, so then they also just built up hills, so you still have houses going up. Is that a fair assessment of that area, or if I got it?
Yeah. So basically Malibu is just a long, skinny strip, right? It's like 13 miles long, just the beach area. It runs east to west in that area. It's right at the beach, right? Malibu is literally just like this little tiny strip. And then Pacific Palisades is like, it's like a little cutout, like a little bowl that goes in. It's like a housing development that goes in, like this little tiny valley where you are correct. The Santa Monica Mountains like just run right up to the beach. And it's this little valley that cuts right into the Santa Monica's just a bit. That's why it was so, ready to be the first one to hit in a fire like this.
And so you know the extent of the damage. Over 10,000 homes were destroyed between all the fires in Altadena, the Eaton fire, and the fires in Pacific Palisades. And I just looked it up. As of January 22nd, they've confirmed 6,662 structures were destroyed in the Pacific Palisades fire. So that's about half, about the same amount, maybe a little less in the Altadena fire. That is insane. That is, and these are areas where fires, and this is where this is really changed. There have been terrible fires like this before. Paradise, for those that aren't from California, this was a forested community. So you had, you were in the middle of this forest in Paradise. In the Altadena and Paradise fires, it is, these are like urban areas that are butt up against these the mountain ranges. And so previously you expect that the homes that are along the outskirts, along the foothills in an urban area, those are the ones that are going to burn. But for most part, the places that are just kind of in the valley that are just flat, those are usually fine.
Right.
And unfortunately, because of several reasons, it went out of control. And it wasn't just the weather. There was, we didn't have the water. The fire hydrants weren't working. You had one thing that was, I know some firefighters, and some of the issues were these electric cars. The electric cars had these lithium batteries that no matter what kind of water you put on them, they will not stop. And the fumes are so
that's right.
They're so horrible. And now think about it. In these areas, you had a lot of electric cars. And so you have these like little, like, what do you call them? Like Molotov cocktails or whatever that are just sitting in the neighborhoods that are, you cannot put them out. So you have these fires that will never go out, that are just, and the embers are flying. So it wasn't just like they could contain it. As soon as you had a fire somewhere else, you had this torch that was never going to go out until the fuel went away. And so there's so many different elements that need to be addressed moving forward, and how, we have to try to provide a better situation so that this can't get out of control like it did.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll make a comment, then I'll finish up my question. I was going to say, well, it's because lithium burns with water, literally explodes. So you can't do it. It's why most firefighters now, a lot of them for vehicle fires, use foam or to put it out vehicle fires, because they don't know what is going to be in the vehicle. So they use foam, which is relatively safe and won't cause a explosion when you're adding water to it. Sorry, my wife works for the fire service, so fun little fact.
I don't know if they,
you guys can take away from CRM, but the question I was going to get at is, so relatively, like if I was looking at like a potential, a predictive map of that sort of area, I would say, certain areas, I guess you guys will know the archaeology of California better. Mm-hmm. Is it sort of like coastal was high potential for, Native American? Is there like sort of Hispanic colonial stuff there as well?
Yes.
But a lot of those on the hillier sides, probably not, I would say. Is that a fair assessment of potential?
But the tribes do not see it. Tribes don't see it that way. And the tribes, specifically with the Coastal Commission, have a lot of sway. So the tribes see that whole area as, they don't look at it necessarily, and I shouldn't say all tribes, but it only takes one tribe to say that they have an issue, right? So during consultation, for those that are not from California, most areas in the country, consultation occurs with federally recognized tribes. In California, it's not only the federally recognized tribes, but it is the California recognized tribes, which there are over like 150. I mean, there's a lot of them. So, and most of them are not federally recognized. So they may not get consultation pursuant to Section 106, but for CEQA, they will. And with Coastal Commission, they do. And so they consider these areas, they don't look at probability models. In fact, they actually kind of laugh them, or they don't, not all of them, but some tribes, and like I said, it only takes one tribe to tell the Coastal Commission that they consider this entire area sensitive, and therefore that's where the mitigation measures are decided upon. And so they'll say that, okay, well, maybe a habitation wouldn't have occurred here, but we would have hunted here, or this was a sacred area for us, or we were gathering here. We gathered botanicals from here. And so for all these different reasons, tribal cultural resources, the definition of them is pretty broad. And so the whole area is considered sensitive. Now, it was sensitive. We do have historic maps, during the initial set, like in the 1800s, we do have verification of villages, and we found, remnants of these villages. So it is a sensitive area, but to say the whole area is sensitive is difficult when it comes to mitigation, because the Coastal Commission doesn't look at it very precisely. It just does this blanket approach. And that's where you come into having, mitigation that's very, very strong, and maybe too strong, and is not appropriate for every property. So, and then the other thing is that Pacific Palisades has a lot of historic landslides and, prehistoric, but it has a lot of historic landslides. And so for those that maybe don't understand or don't know, that when it comes to determining whether something is eligible for, like a significant resource, you really need to have your cultural deposits intact. Now, tribes don't look at it that way. It's still significant to them whether it's intact or not. But when it comes to being eligible for NRHP or the CRHR, they generally need to have intact deposits. And when you have all these mudslides, and then you have, that are historic after habitation, right? Village Native American habitation, it's problematic for, considering whether or not it's significant. And that's why geoarchaeology is such an important aspect of archaeological assessments.
So as a landscapist, I'm totally cool with like the expanded effect of, outside most of the definitions that we find under national registries and stuff like that. So I'm okay with that. But I was going to ask, I might be mixing up the areas. Andrew, you'd said this was mainly a mid-century sort of built town.
Pacific
50s.
Yeah, Pacific Palisades as a development, it's that equivalent of like, welcome to the hypermodern world of 1960, right? It looks like that. Like the first cars to be parked there, I'm sure all had fins, they're like 1960 cars. It has that vibe to it. But yes, and I'm not here to say that there weren't any developments before, but everything there is very post World War II.
Yeah, true. I was just going to say,
Altadena could be old.
It was old. I mean,
old
you had
California.
Victorian homes there. You also had mid-century homes there.
Yeah.
Doug?
And do you guys have like a lot of modern build as well?
In
like
Pacific Palisades, it was interspersed.
Or is it?
I would say, I mean, in these two areas, you had more historic era homes than you had that would be considered that were 50 years or older than you had otherwise, than you had modern.
So the question where I'm going with this is like, I imagine there's likely going to be quite a bit of CRM done in the rebuild, just because, within a mile of the coastal, and, there'll be a fair amount. But what is there actually going to be a lot of chances of actually finding anything in these areas? Because, definitely you'll get peripheral stuff in the hillsides, hunting and gathering and stuff like that, but you don't really find much evidence, in terms of artifacts. Again, I've done things here where basically, it's amazing, like 1960s, 70s, 80s developments almost have no impact on the underlying archaeology. Like they built, they don't really go deep. The foundations are tiny. The pylons,
Right.
10, 20 centimeters, like nothing. But then any modern development we do, it goes down meters and meters, and it takes everything out, like everything.
Oh, yeah.
Like there's, I would say, probably the worst is modern development in the last couple of decades. Basically, if there's been a modern building there, I can guarantee there is no archaeology surviving, because hopefully the archaeologists were there to take it out. Not always the case, but it's just such a devastation. I was wondering, are there areas like that of basically with those modern builds, have they basically scooped out chunks of the hillside to build these houses? And, is there any potential really for finding stuff?
So first of all, in California, slab on grade is very popular. Obviously not in hillside areas. In the hillside, you have caissons. So actually, just like you were saying, and it's the same thing. I mean, and, modern, anything after the 70s, you had where you have CEQA that was involved, and cultural resource requirements that were imposed. In Pacific Palisades, and I've done a lot of work there, a majority of the construction is on pilings, caissons. And so the disturbance is actually limited. You don't want to do too much disturbance if you're using, you're on slopes. They're not grading it all the way down to have a flat area. They're only going to grade a certain amount, what they have to have a flat area for the area they have to have flat. But the rest are on caissons, very, very deep caissons. So the disturbance is limited, and the disturbance will be limited for this new construction as well, at least in the areas that are sloped, that have the sloped terracing, which is a lot of Pacific Palisades. In Altadena, it's a little different. I'm not all that familiar with Altadena, so I don't know. Maybe Andrew can speak to that. Is it slab on grade mainly?
Yeah, I don't. Because it's older. It's it's going to be a bit of a mix. Some will be that old pier, foundation, and like when you have Victorians and craftsmen, and that kind of stuff. But long story short, it's not very, there's not much disturbance happening, with those. But I thought the question too on, would you find new archaeological sites or something? That's a tough one. I was trying to think that a little bit myself, in the specific areas. I would actually, of course, first look for, is there a creek in that area or that kind of thing? Because I've had different experiences in locations, or Pacific Palisades, in terms of the environment. Sometimes you might find, an archaeological site or something, and other times there's really not much of anything. It just depends. It's a tough question for me.
Is this going to be sort of a hidden
I doubt it. Right.
Terrible,
I doubt it.
Everything got destroyed, but in a sense, it's also going to be massively clear up areas that not normally would ever have archaeology done, and may never have archaeology done again in the future.
Yeah.
Is this a sort of Pompeii-esque chance to be able to discover a bunch of hidden archaeological sites, because you just never would get the chance to dig them for the next couple of centuries?
I think that kind of chance is very, very low. That's just my take.
Okay.
Yeah. What would you say, Heather?
Yeah, well, there are considerable areas that were built before cultural resources assessments were really done. Yeah. And they were done on slab and grade, but there's also fill. So we're not going to be digging, they're going to compact, fill. They're going to grade. Grade means both cut and fill. And so it all depends. I mean, these geotechnical reports are going to be important to take a look at and to see whether or not how deep the fill is. And if they are going to be just working with the current fill and they're not going to be cutting it out, then we may not even get down to the levels where cultural resources might exist. Now, we're just talking Native American sites, right? There's obviously lots of other eras that have an archaeological potential. So I think since we're getting long, I do want to say, I don't know if we've really fully answered the question of CRM and what we could. So just really briefly, yes, CRM is going to be involved in this. I think it's going, I really hope, my hope, obviously you always want work, but we don't want to at the detriment of these people that have really suffered a lot. And so my hope is that the assessments are streamlined and are reasonable. My hope is that monitoring is reasonable and done. There's no reason to be having monitoring during, when with the movement of artificial fill. That's ridiculous. There's no reason, I hope that the Coastal Commission will be looking at their mitigation measures, their conditions of approval that they use across the board, and that they really take a second look at this and the city of Los Angeles and really decide, not that you're not going to have any monitoring, but what is reasonable. What needs to happen in order to make sure that if there are cultural resources there, that they are treated appropriately? That should be the motivation. Not for people to be making money off of this rebuilding. And I think that that's going to take some delicate and very precise work to make that happen. And it may end up being that it doesn't happen unless there's legal challenges made. And I think that, of course, we want preservation, but we don't want preservation. Unfortunately, people that just use preservation as a means to pay their bills. And that's not right. And it gives us a bad name. So hopefully there's reasonable approaches and that there's also flexible mitigation so that, it's used where it makes sense and it's avoided where it doesn't. So with that, I do think, actually, that this is a really good inspiration for a podcast that just talks about the different types of jurisdictions and different types of agencies and their approaches. So we'll probably do that. Also, I had a bunch of notes on, the origin of all these laws so that people understand. But I think we'll do another podcast at a later date.
That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at archpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to my co-hosts for joining, and we'll see you in the field.
See you guys next time.
Goodbye.
Take it easy.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Culturo Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.